Hey everybody, it's Dave Dugdale, learningvideo.com. So I'm going to be comparing the Sony a7S II, which I've been using for about 8 months, and the Sony a7R II, which I'm probably using close to a year. Now, what's going to make this comparison a little bit different from maybe other ones you saw 8 months ago is those probably only people use them for a couple weeks and they created comparison videos, where I've been using these for a very long time. I've also created 2 courses, one for each camera, and they're both about 6 hours long. So I feel like I've done a lot of testing with these cameras. What I'm going to tell you at the end of the video is there's one camera that I use way more than the other one, and I'll give reasons why. All right, so really quick, I'm going to step through how the 2 cameras are very similar and how they are not similar. All right, they both have IBIS or steady shot. They both have a weak, or I guess you could say a tiny battery. Both have very similar color science, and both don't overheat now. The a7S II is better in low light, but that's only when you get to really crazy ISOs like over 12,800. But when the a7S III comes out, my guess is it will have a back-illuminated sensor as well, and that will probably just be amazing how well that one will see in the dark. The a7S has S-Log2 and 3, while the a7R just has S-Log2. The a7S II works best in full frame mode, whereas the a7R II works best in crop mode in terms of getting rid of any sort of artifacting like aliasing or moire. Now, however, the a7S II, when you're in full frame mode, you gotta be careful when you're shooting in 4K, because some of that aliasing and moire can creep in, whereas if you're shooting at 1080, 24p, you will get no aliasing and moire. For the a7R II, the lowest you can go for ISO is ISO 800 when you're in S-Log2. However, when you're on the a7S II, the lowest you can go is ISO 1600. The a7R II has 42 megapixels, whereas the a7S II has 12 megapixels. The a7R II has much better video autofocus because it has phase detection, where the a7S II doesn't have any phase detection, so its autofocus is not as good. The a7S II has a way of recording a very flat image, but when you monitor on the back of your camera, you can see it with a much more linear color space. Both cameras will let you record for slow motion by overcranking. However, you can put it in a high frame rate mode on the a7S II and actually play it back in slow motion in camera, something you can't do on the a7R II. The a7S II allows you to record 120 frames per second at 1080, where the a7R II does the same, but at 720. The a7R II will let you shoot in APS-C mode, Super 35, in 4K, where the a7S II will not. Since the a7S II allows you to shoot in full frame mode, you can get more shallow depth of field. Let's say you're doing an interview, you want to blur that background out, you can do that much easier on the a7S II. Now, like I said before, I use one camera more than the other, and that camera that I use most is the a7R II, and let me explain why. A lot of times I will shoot in a creative style like standard, and I'll also shoot in S-Log. I bounce between the two. I don't shoot S-Log all the time. So if I get into a situation where I don't have control over the lighting and it's just really bright and I got a lot of dark areas, I will switch over from my creative style to S-Log. And when I do that, a lot of times it'll be 2 stops too bright. And depending, I said this happens the majority of the time. It doesn't happen all the time depending on the exposure settings. But a lot of times it's 2 stops too bright, which is perfect. And because I like to overexpose S-Log2 about 2 stops to get rid of some of the noise in the shadows. Now, the a7R II has much better autofocus, and it comes with a lot of different tracking speeds and autofocusing speeds as well. So you can set it up really well. I use a lot of time a Pilotfly H2 gimbal, and sometimes I'll put a wide angle lens on there, just put it on autofocus and track somebody walking. It usually does a wonderful job keeping them in focus. Where the a7S II, unfortunately, doesn't work as well on a gimbal with the autofocus mode. I like shooting in 4K a lot. When I'm using the a7R II, I don't really have to worry about any sort of aliasing or moire. Or like I said before, the a7S II is not totally moire or aliasing free in the 4K full frame mode. There's a big difference between 42 megapixels and 12 megapixels when you're shooting landscapes and portraits for stills. You can just zoom way in there on somebody's face if they have some blemishes. In Photoshop, you can get in there very accurately and get rid of them because you can zoom so far into a 42 megapixel image. For my shooting style, both these cameras, I really don't have to worry about noise too much because I typically don't shoot over 12,800, and both of these cameras are pretty comparable all the way up to 12,800. After that, you get above that number, and then yes, the a7S II works well, but I don't typically shoot over that range that many times a year. So that's pretty much it. I would say I use the a7R II probably 95% of the time. I use the a7S II 5% of the time. When I'm doing a 2-camera interview shoot, let's say a CEO, I'll set up the a7R II as my wide shot in 4K APS-C mode, and then I'll use the a7S II in full frame mode at 1080, because I don't have to worry about any sort of aliasing or moire on the CEO's jacket. Now, like I said before, I've got courses on both of these cameras. So let's say you haven't bought one of these cameras yet and you want to buy my course and check it out to see what the camera's like, you can definitely do that. Or if you own the camera and maybe you're having some issues with it shooting video, definitely check out my courses. I'll put a link to my hand right here. And that's pretty much it. Thank you very much for watching this video, and I'll talk to you guys again. Bye.